Well, thanks again, Charles, for joining us. It's great to have you. And, before we get started, it would be great if you could just do a brief introduction of yourself, your background, and with our listeners, and let them know a bit about Charles Tam and who you are.
Sounds good. Thank you for having me, Linda. It's a pleasure to be here and to spend time with you and your listeners. So I'm Charles Tam. I am the Director of Regulatory Affairs, Intelligence and Governance at Edwards Lifesciences in Canada. A little bit about me. I come from a science background, so I did my Bachelor's of Science from U of T. I did my MBA at Ted Rogers School of Management with the Toronto Metropolitan University, formerly Ryerson. And I have a number of progressive steps that I've taken in my career, all within the medical device industry, specifically in regulatory affairs. So I'm coming up to about 2 decades now in this MedTech RA space in very progressive roles. So I started with Becton-Dickinson, and then moved to Johnson & Johnson, then went to Abbott Vascular, and then found myself at Edwards Lifesciences, where I'm here today. So in a whirlwind, it's been a fantastic sort of career exposure, but at the same time, I think it's one of those hidden gems where people really don't quite know what regulatory affairs is. And, it's one of those fun things. I still joke that I don't think my parents still fully know. So hopefully we can demystify that for everyone here today.
Yeah, that's great. It's funny, isn't it? How family don't always know what we do. It's just kind of gets iced over, right? But thank you. Well, great to have you. So one of the first things I thought it would be great to explain to individuals and listeners, what is regulatory affairs, because, whether they're individuals just coming out of university with that science background and wondering, where can I go with my career, or even in companies themselves. I remember being in sales and, got products in my bag and I'm out there selling them. Well, what people don't understand is those products don't get into my bag without, regulatory affairs. Just doesn't happen. So I think it's great to educate everybody and just help them understand what is regulatory affairs, because, there are people looking for a career and we need people to go into regulatory affairs. So, there's roles out there, but also, for companies to understand, when they're looking for individuals in regulatory affairs. We'll get to that too, to, what types of things to look for. So that's great if you could share.
Oh, absolutely. So I guess as a regulatory professional, I have a long version, a verbose long version or a short version. I'm going to do the short version here of what is regulatory affairs.
Okay.
It really is the interface, between a company and the regulatory bodies, because in a regulated industry, whether it's medical devices or medtech in general, pharmaceuticals, aviation, nuclear, these are all industries that have another layer to them, largely for public safety purposes. And to navigate those areas, there is a liaison role and function that works very closely with compliance, very closely with quality, and this is where regulatory comes in. So ultimately, it's that first step to gaining access to the market or gaining access to bring your products to market. And to borrow that sales analogy, I've always made the sort of relation that a lot of what we do in regulatory also has an element of building trust, like building your reputation and building relationships. So I see a key account manager role quite simply with regulatory affairs. It just happens that the key account happens to be Health Canada or US FDA or Australia TGA. And it's one of those situations where over time, over interactions, you build those trusted relationships so that you understand the needs of both sides. So understanding how to balance the commercial corporate needs, which may be to accelerate a launch, maybe to prioritize a submission, and to also understand what are the other levers on the regulatory or the regulator side from a regulatory compliance perspective. What are the concerns that they have, susceptible, vulnerable populations, or new risks that are class specific that relate to that particular device or product. So as that interface, regulatory has a broad mandate to really facilitate, enable business, and also enable compliance, and also help the regulator understand where the technology is going, help shape that future policy, and to sort of have that both tactical and strategic edge as we conduct business in a regulated environment.
So, there's you who, went into the industry. So, you know, why a career in regulatory? Like, why did you choose that?
I like to think, quite honestly, it chose me. But then at the same time, once it, once I understood what it was, I definitely chose regulatory and never took a step back. So perhaps I'll start from the beginning. When I was at Becton-Dickinson, I was still effectively fresh out of school. My first job out of school was actually in the lab, and I realized it wasn't quite sort of the working environment that I would enjoy. At the same time, I tend to be more of an introvert. So it wasn't that I wanted to go into the field and carry a bag. It was more that I wanted to see and do something different. So that's where I ended up actually in the first role in the medical device world. It was bilingual customer service. So in this customer service role, I was supporting orders, taking down POs, placing orders, working with supply chain delivery, customer service requests like late delivery, short shipments, all that. So really getting not realizing, but getting a great overview of that element of the business, of the medical device industry as a whole. And then about a few months in, we started having all these inquiries from our customers. And I think I had received the third one, and it was all talking about these chemical substances and what we call phthalates today. But at that time, we didn't quite have a good category for them. And the industry had been monitoring, Health Canada had been monitoring. But to me, as this junior customer service representative, I didn't really have a good grasp on that, but I did understand from the science side of things how to put all those puzzle pieces together. So I had sent a note to our quality and regulatory department. I remember they had done a presentation, say if you see something, say something. And I said, hey, this is a trend that I'm noticing. Customers are asking about what we know today as BPA, DEHP. And I said, hey, from my animal physiology labs, I remember that this has some sort of endocrine disruption potential. Now we know for sure it does. But I flagged that to them. And, lo and behold, in a few minutes, they started coming into that customer service department area. And I was thinking, oh, okay, well, there must be something big happening. You've got the two sort of senior managers coming down the line. And I was seated at the very back. So if you can imagine sort of an office structure, I'm at the back, I'm the most junior. Typically, no one comes to see me yet. But they had come in, and then all of a sudden, rounding the corner was the director of RAN quality. He was the most senior person in that function for the country. And ultimately, all three of them came to see me. I had identified something that they were very cognizant of and interested in learning more about. So they wanted to see my notes, they wanted to understand the situation. And starting from that interaction, I learned a lot more about what quality does, what regulatory affairs does, what compliance does. And from that point on, HR was kind enough to do a sort of job sharing. I would do half my role in my original customer service role. And then I would spend the other time sort of more of an exploratory development, trying out regulatory, trying out quality, trying out compliance. And ultimately, history is what it was. I went into the regulatory stream and I have never looked back. It's been an incredible career full of growth, opportunities, curiosities. And certainly it's something that I speak very highly of and I'm very passionate about. It's one of those weird places where you can mix the science with the policy, with the human interaction, and also a lot of the detailed technical work that ultimately is what I alluded to earlier, putting puzzle pieces together.
And when you look at, like, you progressed in your career, right, in terms of your different roles. So can you just give an example of maybe the different roles you've had? And if someone was considering going into regulatory, what are the potential career opportunities that they could have?
Absolutely. So my career history has actually been quite linear. So when I got into that, so after that customer service role, I continued on at Becton-Dickinson as a regulatory affairs associate. There I was doing more of the administrative technical sides of regulatory, so checking submissions, preparing some of the more lower class submissions or lower risk class submissions. Ultimately, I was promoted to senior associate. And then after I had the opportunity at J&J to pursue a broader range of product categories and risk types. So moving into J&J as a regulatory specialist, I had a chance to then expand into orthopedics, cardiovascular products, in vitro diagnostics, sterilizers, endoscopic devices. So a much broader bag of different technologies within the medical technology space, including digital health, or early digital health at the time. Then I progressed to my first management role at Abbott Vascular. Had a chance to really focus heavily on cardiovascular products and dig deep into that particular sector. And from there, a few years later, the opportunity for Edwards came along, and it was again sort of another focus point of transcatheter heart valves. So one of the highest risk products in Canada. And for me, the technology was just fascinating to understand, where the technology could go, where the policies could go, and ultimately how the regulatory structure also could evolve as technologies improve. So then that brings us to present day, where it's still transcatheter heart valves, but with a whole other range of variety of different products in the digital health space, for instance, the hemodynamic monitoring, in addition to that cardiovascular focus. So, along these lines, you can see that there are very technical, science-based, engineering-based. So anyone really from a STEM background would do well sort of getting into the regulatory space. There are also a variety of programs now that help accelerate that entry into the market space, or into the regulatory function rather, that I didn't have access before or wasn't even aware about. So even today now for undergraduate programs and graduate programs, there are different postgraduate programs as well, which talk about regulatory. So just recently, I signed on to give another guest lecture with a colleague of mine, Dr. Gabriella Chen at the University of Toronto. She teaches a translational research program course. And one of those areas is how do you translate that research into regulatory so that you can then commercialize that product? It also tied really close to another part that's close to my heart, which is the innovation piece. In the regulatory space, it's one of those fun areas where you're on that cusp of R&D and you get to see where that new technology is going. And through my support that I give at U of T, going back to my alma mater, I also support their Health Q Innovation Hub. So this is a health incubator hub out of their Temerty's Faculty of Medicine there. And it has been an incredibly insightful sort of experience. I learn as much as the others learn from me, this exchange of understanding. I see things from a multinational lens, but being able to see it from a startup or small medium enterprise, seeing it from their small business lens, it's also been very insightful to understand the challenges that they have and to also bring that back, because in the grand scheme of things, the higher you move up into regulatory, the more it stays technical, but it also adds that strategic policy side of things. And that's really what I find super exciting, because now you can start to fingerprint on what the future could hold as far as policies evolution, regulations coming, consultations in the works. And as we look at where these new technologies go, regulations will always sort of be one or two steps behind, sometimes even more. But this is where, as a regulatory professional, you have the opportunity to bridge that gap. So it's less the black and white that people tend to associate with regulatory, but it's like as you zoom in on that black line, you realize there's infinite shades of gray. And with those shades of gray, it allows you to really help shape and move the needle on, again, finding that earlier balance between what the regulator is looking for versus what your organization or what your objectives are, and to find that medium where it's a win-win solution for all.
So it's exciting in terms of there's other paths, career paths in medical device, right, in healthcare. And, I get called all the time, as you can well imagine, and I know we've talked about this, about individuals looking to get into the industry. And so often it's a myopic pathway. People think sales, medical sales, I want to get into sales, and yet they don't necessarily have a clear understanding or the personality. And I interview them and I talk to them and I try to say, well, have you thought about regulatory, or have you thought about a different career path, right, as opposed to sales? Because it's really not for everybody when I start to talk to them and they see what they're interested in. So that's why I was so interested in having you as a guest, because I'm trying to open up individuals' thought process in terms of, all the other areas. And we do, like you're saying, there's other pathways that people can, fast forward in a much easier way than you did to get into regulatory, right? But it's also, if you think about yourself hiring, like you've had team members report to you, what is it that you look for when you're interviewing individuals? Like, what are some of the key things that they want to think about when they're interviewing with you that you've seen some people don't do, that you would say, these are 3 or 4 things that are really key for you that you want to do to be successful in an interview with a manager in regulatory?
That one is a great question. In fact, that one actually came up in a few different ways during that guest lecture at the end when I was doing the Q&A. In fact, it's almost one of the staple questions. As a hiring manager in regulatory, one of the key things that I look for first and foremost is some element of curiosity. With regulatory, it's one of those roles where you will get a chance to get exposed to a variety of different things. So regulatory has a finger in the pot when it comes to supply chain, releasing products. It's sort of obvious with the approval process. Once you get approval, it has to be communicated over to supply chain, and there are processes involved. From a marketing standpoint, the control and review of promotional materials, regulatory has a hand in clinical trials, working with the clinical medical teams, R&D, just by the nature of the process. But at the same time, there's also this post-market side of things, working with our sales team to ensure that not only are you figuratively installing new lights, but you're also keeping the lights on. And ultimately, at the end of it, you need to change that bulb when that time comes. So there is this life cycle approach to regulatory that really touches on a variety of different things. It would be one heck of a messy Venn diagram for those that want to envision it. But regulatory has that unique space where it's in the middle. And that's where that curiosity is number one, because you're going to need to be agile enough, nimble enough to want to learn about the different functions, not necessarily become an expert, but want to learn. And then the other one is sort of aptitude and the base knowledge and sort of self-awareness to understand that the regulatory role is going to be a dynamic and exciting one, where one day is not going to be the same as another day, but at the same time, there are sort of common facets that you can anticipate. What I always say is I hire for that aptitude and attitude, but I can train for the knowledge and those other specifics. So it's an important piece that you understand that for anybody coming into the regulatory role, I find the biggest indicators of successes are, does that person sort of have the right mindset of wanting to come in as a continuous learning? And I've always sort of remarked, especially when I talk to my colleagues that I've had the chance to spend 20 plus years with, and those that have sort of been in the industry for all their lives, as they've remarked to me, some of the best regulatory affairs really start treating their profession almost as a trade. You want to constantly perfect your craft. It's this, yesterday's submission was great, but and it was on time, but do you think you could do it a week earlier? Do you think you could get that approval sooner? Could that technical document be more concise so that when the reviewer gets to it, they are getting exactly what they need so that they can come to a decision? You're not overburdening them with more information. You're not providing them so little information that it's triggering questions and then resulting in delays, and being able to sort of find that happy medium. And of course, every time you work on a submission, for instance, that one being sort of the most common task, each submission is going to be different because you're working with a different product at a different stage of time with different standards that apply. And it's sort of this moving bar. So you're measuring yourself against this moving bar. Regulations 10 years ago was not the regulations of today. Mm-hmm. Things get tougher, things get more difficult, and largely because we know more. As the sphere of knowledge increases and that volume increases, so does the surface area of all the risks that it gets exposed to. So it's one of those elements that, again, it comes back to, from a hiring perspective, you got to hire for certain traits and certain things that you can't teach or are very difficult to teach, and some of the things that you can teach, focus less on them, but still ensure that the fundamentals are there.
And have you found that some candidates that come in and they interview, like you're talking about curious and mindset, obviously, and attitude and aptitude, which are things I talk about all the time, right? But sometimes candidates, they're in a hurry, right? They're in a hurry for their career to progress. They're in a hurry to, make the money they want to make. It's that patience level that I'm not seeing the same as what I saw 5 years ago with candidates that are entering the market, or even that have been in the market for a few years. They're anxious to get the job, or they're anxious to get promoted. They just don't have that same patience level. Have you noticed that in your interviews?
I have, and I think there's a moderating effect as well within the regulatory profession. I mean, by definition, if you're someone that's streaming yourself into regulatory, you may have already sort of screened out going into more of a sales role or going into something in that area or element. So there is perhaps another self-selection element there too. But I mean, that said, there is a general theme of people are hungry. People want to challenge themselves to do more. They want to take that next step. They want to stretch. And I think that's incredibly respectful. I mean, I think that's something where we don't want to lose that energy. But part of what's interesting about regulatory is the entire profession is built around structures which slow things down in a sense. And part of the ways that we can look at is not necessarily that it slows things down, but rather that it forces you to go through a methodological step. And this applies really well to those that are in engineering, to that STEM background, to the science. The scientific method can't be rushed. Similarly, the regulators will always tell you a scientific review cannot be rushed. You cannot simply review faster. That introduces errors. A review will take as long as the review will take. So part of those governing structures is part of the consistency element of regulatory affairs. So it's something that becomes familiar. And for those that are fresh into the industry, fresh coming into the role in the industry, especially, they will learn that, we can only go so fast because it's a two-party system. It's, once there's a handoff to the regulator has a process, and we're responsible for that total life cycle. So we can optimize our internal side, not at the cost of reducing quality and not at the cost of introducing error. But at the same time, you have to realize there are other transfers in place. So part of that is also that education as well. Is absolutely, we are all, interested in challenges, taking on that potential stretch and seeing where that goes, or having explored it and realizing that's not the direction you want to go. But I mean, this is where it's part of that open dialogue, especially during the interviews, where they're presumably asking to better understand and learn about what kind of role is involved. And it's also incumbent on the hiring manager and whoever's giving those interviews to provide that insights. Like, this is an industry that is not, an information technology company. It is not a sector where things move, such as fashion or things like that move on a different pace. Medical devices have to go through this rigor and structure. So by definition, being aware of that and certainly sort of coming to terms with that is also a very key thing that will come out usually during the interviews, or at least I ensure that comes out, especially when it's more of an entry-level role or first step in.
Right. And I think that's important and you're exactly bang on. I always try to explain that with hiring managers, is we want to be sure that that we explain the role very clearly as to expectations, what it's going to look like, and the candidates have a clear understanding of that. Then you have a good match, right? They're not going to get in there 6 months later and go, oh my God, this isn't what I thought, and I'm out of here, right? We don't want that to happen. And in terms of yourself, you're involved in a lot of different like teaching and that sort of stuff. Do you have a mentorship program in the company for your new hires, or just individuals within your team that you yourself provide, or you encourage that of other team members to help people be successful?
Our organization does have formal programs, but I find it's often the more informal programs that are perhaps the most powerful, because just because the organization doesn't have one, it doesn't mean the individual can't seek them out. So find someone, and what I found, at least in my personal experience, and certainly this was feedback that I got when I was more junior in my role, is find someone you admire and work up the courage to start a conversation with them, to let them know about you, let them interact with you, and ultimately see if they could be a mentor or coach for you. And this has been something that I've found incredibly invaluable, because it's different people, even in different roles that aren't even in the same function. You learn so much from interacting with those individuals, because you see sort of different facets of how things get done. You sort of see different personality types need to that thrive in certain roles, and how it could also be something that you could temporarily turn on in a circumstance where it may be helpful for you. So one of my, as I mentioned earlier, I tend to be more of an introvert. So you give me an opportunity at a large party, I'll be there. I'll sort of walk around, say hi to everyone, but odds are I'll be among the more early or sort of late early folks that'll probably duck out with the small group later in the evening. But that said, I mean, understanding sort of different personalities in the room, understanding the different things that you can learn, that curiosity underlies it all. Sitting down with a top sales regional manager, sitting down with the managing director of a company, understanding what their pain points are, that becomes incredibly insightful when we're having these negotiations with the regulators, understanding that, one pain point that may not be such a big deal for the regulator to sort of move on could be a significant pain point for the organization. So then having that ability to know, having that discussion, because it's not always a situation where you can go back and ask for more clarification. Sometimes you're at a situation where a decision needs to be made really quickly, and then being informed enough sort of through those interactions is very key. So I mean, going back to that mentorship coaching question, that is one of those things where people just don't prioritize enough, and I admit it to myself. I wish I could do more, and that's why even now I make the effort to do so. Whenever I happen to be near someone, it's a simple thing. Hey, I'm in Ottawa for a meeting with Health Canada. Afterwards, we're done at 5, but you want to grab dinner? I'll grab a late flight out. I have to head back anyways, and I'd rather spend time with you than spend time at the airport. Catch up. So I mean, it's one of those situations where you can carve out that time. But I mean, this is also something you have to be consciously putting forward to do, and be not necessarily be strategic, but be genuine about it. I mean, they should be individuals you admire, individuals that are actually able to spend time with you, and be willing to spend the time to sort of discuss things with you. So I mean, this is it's not easy, but if it were easy, everyone would be doing it.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. It's that mentorship, and just like you said, being curious and wanting to learn and really invest in, your next career move, or learning about an industry that has potential, such as regulatory. Individuals, when I interview them or I meet them, I can see it immediately. Those people who stand out, who truly are curious individuals, who truly have the right attitude, right? All those things, they have an aura about them. That's who they are, right? So you can't fake that. So I think that, you're bang right on. I share those sentiments. What do you think are some of the unique hurdles or I shouldn't say hurdles. Yeah, let's talk about that. Hurdles that we're going to experience in the next couple of years in the industry, especially in MedTech.
Oh, absolutely. So one of the hurdles, or at least this is a broad hurdle, sort of with multiple subpoints, but I mean, at the high level, our industry and the regulated world as a whole tends to be more and more globalized day by day. And it's funny, we go back to, 15 years ago or more, there was always talk about harmonization. Then harmonization turned into convergence. Now we're at that point where we're starting to see some of that convergence. And in some areas it's diverging because it's come too close and it's sort of separating again. But what I see is that challenge is that as the world sort of does continue on this general trend of converging in the regulatory space, it also introduces these new global market dynamics that are different. So a good one is this whole European increase in regulation rigor. So MDD to MDR, for those in the in vitro diagnostic space, your IVDR, IVDD, IVDR, that's coming. Even on the medical devices side, the implementation's been delayed, but it's been an interesting dynamic because you have what is traditionally a more innovation favorable market now increasing rigor, which means they're less innovation friendly and more risk adverse. So there is this unfortunate balance where if you want the innovation, it comes hand in hand with the risk. It's this balancing scale. So Europe, for instance, with their MDR, they had a number of very public situations where medical devices unfortunately fell through some cracks from a regulatory perspective. And as a result, they've patched the cracks, but there's a concept in more on the quality side called CAPA, so corrective action, preventative action. It's fine enough to correct things up front, but you also need to think about systematically, how would you have prevented it in the first place? So part of that prevention is to find balance of what extra or additional or modifications do you need to make to your system to sort of prevent that same reoccurrence. And what we're seeing in the regulatory world today is this tightening, which is almost, and depending on who you ask, is not enough, overdue, or far too much extra regulation that is now being applied. And this also changes the dynamic. So the region that would have received technologies first, they may no longer be in that situation. So typically from a commercialization strategy standpoint, from a business standpoint, it's not possible to launch in every market at every time. And that's typically not how things are done, especially in medical devices. Typically you would launch in one or two target primary markets, gauge how successful that is. Ideally, that success can also translate into reinvestment to target more harder to access markets that have tighter regulation. So traditionally, if we go back to say like more commonly on medical devices, you would go to Europe first, for instance, for their CE mark. So access the entire European Union. From there, those products are in the market, demonstrating their value, creating evidence, creating value, and then that value is being taken back, put into R&D, and then you're then focusing on other tougher markets, potentially Japan, US, Canada sits in one of those areas as you expand into other markets. So there's this sort of flow down. So as that sequence changes now, from a regulatory standpoint, we are now looking at potentially other markets ahead of Europe, other markets at the same time as Europe. And these markets all have different needs and different requirements. So as a regulatory professional, it's not the sort of original state of play where you would depend on sort of that step up effect. You may have to ultimately step up in parallel with the other regions. So part of that is understanding, well, what's the gap? What is the testing gap? Are they on a 2020 standard, or are they on a 2022 standard? What is considered recognized for them? What is considered recognized on the Canadian side? So it's all this gap analysis and sort of strategic planning that now has to come in place that historically we didn't have. So this is perhaps one of the biggest regulatory specific challenges that are coming in. And then one other one that's the most underlying is that regulators really have a incredibly tough job. I mean, imagine a role where you can do 99 out of 100 things right, but that one thing that you do wrong, or that you didn't know you did wrong, and it comes out later because you didn't have the knowledge or data before when that decision was made, is the one that the media blows up, becomes a question period in House of Commons, becomes a premier's mandate, becomes a political hot potato as a sense. And that becomes then your driving reason to make changes on a timeline that is very accelerated. So this is where, from a regulator lens, that's why they tend to be very risk averse. They really want to ensure that 99 can go to 99.99, realizing it's impossible to be perfect, but they want to try as hard as they can. And in doing so, there's that balance that has to be struck on how much you're going to put on that risk innovation balance. And this is where we see that's, presumably the swinging of the pendulum on the European side to one extreme, where it was potentially more so on the other. So this is, when you put all those together, those are sort of the big systematic risks that I see in the industry. Nothing, not necessarily for any wrong or bad reasons. This is, as I sort of hinted at earlier, as it's expected, certainly as that volume of knowledge and safety information grows. Again, that sphere of all the risks that it touches also grows. So it's one of those things, as we know more, that's the burden of knowledge, we now have to deal with more.
And so, there were some things obviously that happened in Europe that, we hear about, we're aware. But knowing that, we want, I guess, as a consumer, I'll call myself a consumer, you want to know that, companies have all of those checks and balances and that our government makes sure. But at the same time, as a consumer, we don't want it to be delayed or prevented. Like, we want products to come to market. That's always, everyone thinks like let's giddy up, bring the products to us. But it's good to know, though, I'm a healthcare professional. That's where I started my career, as a registered nurse. So, I know how important it is to not just let anything come through the door and into the patient's hands, or to the nurse's hands and into the patient. But, where's that fine balance? And that's what you talked about, right? It's making sure we have that fine balance and have good products, right? Innovation, bring the newer products. I mean, when I think about the changes that have happened since I graduated and have been working in healthcare, it's astronomical. When you think about the products you're working on now, it's unbelievable. So, we've come a long way, but being a part of it from a regulatory perspective, it has to be incredibly rewarding at the same time. It's always scary. Anytime you are a healthcare professional of any level, I think it is scary sometimes. Like, if you really think about it, you think, oh, geez, that's a lot of pressure. But at the same time, it's very rewarding, right?
Absolutely.
What do you think in terms of the opportunities, or where the products that are coming to market that maybe it's not necessarily what your company's focused on, but that, out there when you're going to conferences and meeting with your peers, what do you think are some of the really innovative, exciting opportunities that individuals can look forward to in the next, 10 years, 5 years, 10 years, that you see, that you think, wow, that's just incredible. We're making headway there.
Absolutely. So keeping it sort of on a regulatory lens, this is something that's it's been on the mind of both the regulatory profession, the industry, of course, and also the regulators themselves. So in Health Canada parlance, even going back to June 2019, so before the pandemic, legislation was brought into our Food and Drugs Act, so something called ATP. Now, for the biology folks, I'm not talking about that ATP. I'm talking about advanced therapeutic products. And it's an entirely new category of drug devices, or any combination of things that are too complex or undefined or distinct that existing regulations can't handle. And, things like open framework machine AI, machine learning AI, for instance, in a healthcare situation, where the algorithm is not closed and is not, it's not necessarily like a cookbook where if you follow the ingredients and you follow the instructions, you're going to get the same output, or at least a similar output. This is where you really don't know what that process is. What goes in will come out different. If you send it in again, it'll come out different. So a good example is, for anyone who's played with any of those generative AIs from a chat perspective, or the chat GPTs, or if you played with any of those image generation AI software, that same input. So if you put in the same data set over and over again, it generates novel content each time. Nothing is going to be a similar output. So how would you regulate that as a regulatory approach? And that's really been a huge question mark, and it continues to be a major question mark. So what Health Canada, and in consultation with the industry associations and with their touch points, they've created these advanced therapeutic product categories. It's still sort of an empty box, but it's to create this regulatory sandbox. And in how we manage that sandbox is be flexible at the fact that it's going to be unique, create product or category specific additional rules, regulations, constraints, or allowances within that sandbox to facilitate that innovation, because there is an acknowledgement that regulatory leverage is having a certain framework, but then when it's rigid in a non-rigid world anymore, that's no longer the case. So I certainly see digital health being that first cusp. We're also seeing a lot more adoption of different nanotechnologies, nanotextures, coatings, and things like that. I mean, this tends to be something that's been talked about for well over 15, 20 years. Even when I was joining, we were talking about different things like that or coming across it. But we're certainly seeing the applications now. And it's one of the situations where you can analogously look over into some of the other, say, consumer wearables world, see where the early hints are. Take note, for instance, for me as a regulatory person, just a sidebar, fine print never has been bolder and bigger than it actually is. Because when you see those consumer devices, like, not for medical device or not for medical use, or different disclaimers about what those are for, that's sort of a hint of where that technology could go. So when we see like what the Apple Watch can do, what different smart rings, smart watches, and other sort of smart sensor bands can do, that's also a hint at where that technology could go. And those sensors can always find their ways into existing more traditional technologies, but it could just be a matter of when, not necessarily if. So understanding this situation of it's not just going to be fitting in that one box, that box itself has to be flexible. This is where that advanced therapeutic products framework will come in. And this is all relatively new. I mean, it just came into legislation again, during the pandemic. It's been talked about just before. There's an entirely new Schedule G in the Food and Drugs Act that is, again, blank, but built specifically to handle it when it comes in. So there's a lot of these things that are coming from a technology standpoint. And this is why, as a regulatory professional, it's even more important to be curious, because I didn't get into this in the earlier sort of intro part, but I actually got into U of T for computer science. That was actually my passion all through high school. I was all about, I wanted to work on computers, wanted to work computer programming, different programming languages, all that sort of thing, only to realize in my first year of undergraduate studies, like, wait, I have to do 3 years of intense math before I even get a fourth year of actual computer coding and the things that I was interested about. And that's what made me pivot into sciences. But having that curiosity means I have to pick up those old computer science sort of elements, especially when we're doing regulatory submissions in digital health space. Alarm testing, failure mode testing, looking at different software bug analysis. Regulatory requires you to know a little bit about a lot. And this is sort of one of the areas where a personality and aptitude, that curiosity, if it's naturally there, will lend itself very well, because it doesn't then feel tedious. It actually feels interesting, because you're deriving that benefit of knowledge through the process itself, in addition to getting the job done.
And the one thing that I hear throughout the theme of what we've been talking about is the role itself is the constant change of something new and different all day long, right? That you get a variety. It's stimulating. There's lots of change and opportunity throughout the day. And, obviously you talked about STEM earlier, that coming from one of those backgrounds, or even a couple of them, would be a huge benefit within the role. And, it sounds like you've had to stay up to date, and you learn a lot throughout your career, for sure. And if you don't, you're left behind. And you made a comment earlier, and I loved it. What regulatory was 10 years ago most certainly isn't the same today, right? That'd be impossible. You'd be left surely behind if you thought it was. Yeah, that's for sure. But any last few tips or anything you'd like to share that you think is important, or that you had on your mind before we started, that you want to share?
That's a good one. That's a good question. As far as things that I think are really important for people to know about regulatory, it really goes down to the basics. It's not rocket science. It's like, that is a pure STEM topic. But I mean, this is a role where it's just everything mixed together. So there's also an element of legal that we didn't get to touch on, dealing by virtue with interpreting and applying acts and regulations. I often find myself, having a good legal person to bounce thoughts off of. So understanding the regulations, there's always that element of what is written versus what is intended. And so there are some great examples of where, even in the Canadian medical devices regulation, there are elements where certain things aren't explicitly stated. But as an industry, we've made that risk decision in the benefit of the user or the patient, so yourself as an RN, where we may take action or take a regulatory action even when it's not prescribed. So it's one of those things where when we look at sort of the big picture, this is where regulatory has that unique situation again to sort of shape the environment. As a new person coming in, their world will be primarily technical, but as you progress through the regulatory roles and the progressive career developments, you'll find that it is going to be more strategic. It's going to be more policy focused. It's going to be more involving negotiations. So just touching on something you mentioned earlier, when it comes to users of the product, patients who receive the product. So especially for an RN, that's in the case you're in high pressure situations, you have somebody whose life is effectively in your hands, or in the team of hands. And in that circumstance, is just implicit trust that the device is going to do what it's supposed to do. And that's what the regulatory process is supposed to ensure. And that's where, there are a lot of things that can be viewed as burdensome and tiresome. And we talked about the career as being very exciting and dynamic, and that is true. And this is why I stayed in it as long as I have, and I have never looked back. Even when I was doing my MBA, everybody else was, they wanted to pursue a career switch to finance, or they wanted to look into investment banking or something like that. I was that oddball that said, actually, no, I'm quite happy in the function I am, but I'm here to learn about what everybody does. I want to understand what finance people are talking about. I want to understand what supply chain is talking about. I want to understand about marketing and sales. So this is where, coming back to that whole point of balancing those risks, negotiation will become increasingly important in the later stages of the career, especially when it comes to managing those risks, because sometimes Health Canada may be on the cusp of a decision, and there is an openness to have a negotiation to say, like, well, perhaps it's not appropriate for a full commercial license. Maybe there's some sort of commercial conditional license that might be appropriate if we could offer, elevated post-market surveillance. So this is like additional reporting on a regular basis to alleviate the, gray question mark that's sort of looming over a specific topic for X period of time or to the satisfaction of the regulator. So, I mean, there are different things one can offer, but you have to understand sort of the context of where your organization is, or context of the level of trust that you've sort of been able to garner with the regulatory agency, and the relationship of, the individual side of getting to know people. So, I mean, this is where, again, being able to sort of use those different skill sets, borrow what's great from the mentors and the coaches that you see, and no one's perfect. You can admire someone and you can say, yeah, I probably still wouldn't have done it that way. And that's exactly fine. So, I mean, this is where, as regulatory, it really just means just keep an open mind. And that's one of those things that, again, to go back to what you said or reiterated, regulatory 10 years ago is not the regulatory of today. The regulatory in 10 years will not be the regulatory of today. Those that thrive will be those that are most able and most agile and can adapt to sort of what those changes are. And ideally, you'll feel like those changes are sort of a natural progression, sort of something new to learn, something to adapt to, and not necessarily reflect on, well, I used to be able to send the fax. Well, who still has a fax machine?
Well, some people might be listening and going, what's a fax?
So there you go. So that's a Google. So for the curious of you, that's a Google.
Yeah.
That's exactly it. And no joke. Just a few years ago, there used to be something at Health Canada that we still lovingly called the fax fac. And it was basically, you would send a facsimile message to Health Canada on a certain form, and they would sign and acknowledge it and send it back to you, ideally as soon as possible, even same day in the olden days.
Yeah,
and that
exactly.
piece of paper would come through, and that would be your regulatory approval. That does not exist today, but
Yeah.
you will still
Uh,
hear that term being thrown around every now and then, usually just for kicks.
yeah. Well, it's funny because, even when I was in sales leadership within a corporation, I think, when you go into sales, you don't really understand what other people do to a full capacity unless you're networking and have mentors like you talked about, which, I did. And I'm very thankful for a couple of them. They really helped me a lot. But when you go into leadership roles, then you start to really understand, like you're talking about, logistics and regulatory and marketing and finance and what other individuals do. And I would think back then as a sales professional and think, geez, I didn't have a clue really what the impact was of what salespeople did, or when you're out negotiating, and really truly what the impact to the business was or why decisions were made, right? But once you do get to another role and you start to understand different positions and what those roles were, it was like an eye-opening experience. So how important it is. But then, going into recruiting for the last 20 years, I hate to admit that, working with all the different companies and different positions and leaders, being curious, of course, just like you talk about, that's, why I've been doing what I do for so long. I like to learn, and I'm very curious. I think it is important to really understand, and in my job, I need to understand how all those different positions interact and impact businesses and make them successful. I think, talking to new individuals or individuals as across all companies, you need to understand what different positions do in the companies. Because when you do, your whole mindset changes in terms of how you make decisions, how you interact with your customers, and how you can grow within an organization. Because someone could go from sales into regulatory, someone could go from marketing into regulatory, vice versa. And it just makes you a much more well-rounded individual. You see the world three-dimensional, and it's just so much more satisfying, I think, and gratifying. And I'm positive our guests will have gotten a lot from you today. And I know that when I first started my career, I wish I had had a podcast like this, and from all the different areas, because it really helps to develop yourself for sure. But thank you so much for joining us. That's for sure. And I look forward to keeping in touch. And I can't believe it's been 20 years for you, pretty much, that you've been, you'd never know it. And you've been very successful, that's for sure. So anybody who's just starting their career or mid-career, they should really look you up on LinkedIn and look what your career path's been. Thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I welcome folks reaching out. I think this is, one of the functions where I didn't know about it, and any opportunity to start sharing that, or at least letting people know that this is an option. It's something that I find just incredibly interesting, because I was also that kid where, as I grew up, I was always very laser focused on that one computer science. I was laser focused on that one topic. But then as soon as I realized that wasn't for me, all of a sudden I had no idea. I wanted everything. Like, I wanted to know a little bit about everything. And I actually found something that allows you to get into a little bit of everything. So, with that said, I invite people to please reach out to me. I'll share with you the contact information, and we can post that as well. And, certainly it has been a pleasure. The time just blew past. Thank you, Linda, for having me. It is a pleasure to be on this podcast, and certainly look forward to interacting with you and any others who want to stay curious.
Great. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Take care.